Dying Mustang horse was bought by a veteran. What happened next was truly astonishing. They said the horse wouldn't make it through the week. Skin and bones, eyes like ash, barely able to stand. No one saw value in him. No one except a war veteran. As he didn't buy the horse out of pity, he bought it because he recognized something in its eyes. And soon the whole town would see what happens when you believe in what everyone else has already given up on. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, don't forget to subscribe. A scorching morning sun hung above the dusty fields of Montgomery County Fairgrounds, its rays cutting through a sky the color of pale denim. The heat drifted off the red earth, shimmering with the promise of an intense day. Rows of trucks and trailers lined the makeshift parking area, while families, ranchers, and traders bustled around in a chaotic dance of commerce. From a distance you could catch the blended smell of sweat, sun-baked grass, and horsehair, an unmistakable perfume that spoke of the Southwest. Bright flags fluttered at every corner advertising tax supplies and feed stalls. Beneath a series of corrugated metal roofs, dozens of horses were tied to rails or standing in cramped pens, each one groomed to near perfection. Glossy coats reflected the fierce Texan sun, showing off the pride of their owner. You could hear the steady rhythm of hooves clomping across wooden planks, interspersed with auctioneers announcing upcoming lots. People gathered in clusters, bargaining or exchanging local gossip. It was a typical horse auction in Texas, equal parts spectacle and tradition, where fortunes could be made or lost by a single nod of the head. Ethan Carter walked slowly among the crowd, taking in every sight without any real intention to buy. He was in his early 40s, his face weathered by both time and the relentless desert sun. A faint scar snaked around his left wrist, a souvenir from a life he didn't like to discuss in detail. Dressed in a faded plaid shirt and well-worn jeans, he drew little attention from the throngs of buyers, sellers, and onlookers. Most of them were focused on the robust horses that would fetch a good price, or on the ranch equipment lined up for sale. A veteran who once served in Afghanistan, Ethan now lived quietly on a modest ranch in Amarillo, with his wife and young son. The dryness in the air and the hum of conversation took him back to the Middle East for a fleeting moment, reminding him of loud markets, swirling dust, and the uncertain calm that precedes chaos. He'd driven here with just a few $100s in his pocket, barely enough to buy a few bales of hay or fix part of his aging barn's roof. He never intended to purchase any livestock. He had come mostly out of curiosity, an excuse to mingle with the outside world and observe how folks around here carried on, as he liked to say. As he wandered past row after row of perfectly conditioned horses, his eyes suddenly caught something in a far corner, away from the main stage where the more prized animals stood. At first glance, he wasn't sure if it was indeed a horse or simply a silhouette, a bundle of bones pressed against a rough wooden stall. But as he drew closer, the shape became painfully clear. A scrawny, malnourished creature, whose coat was a patchwork of faded gray and patches of pale skin. Its sides were caved in, each rib visible under the dull fur. The horse's head hung low, ears sagging as though it had resigned itself to whatever fate waited beyond this dismal place. It was trembling, and its eyes, dull as dust, seemed almost empty. Yet if you looked closely, there was a flicker of something deeper. Ethan paused, feeling a tug in his chest. This was no ordinary sympathy for a neglected animal. There was an echo of familiarity in the horse's struggle, a reflection of silent anguish and persistent memory. He stood still for a long time, oblivious to the movement of people around him, as if drawn into a private world of shared sorrow. The horse gave a weak snort, shifting its weight from one shaky hind leg to the other. It was the kind of posture that spoke of repeated starvation, a body worn thin by neglect. In that moment, Ethan was swept into a memory more vivid than sweltering fairground. He saw himself years earlier, back in Afghanistan, leading a chestnut warhorse named Shadow through the rocky terrain of Kandahar. Shadow was no ordinary horse. He was a steadfast ally, unwavering and courageous. Ethan remembered a particular patrol when an unseen landmine nearly cost him his leg, or worse. But Shadow had sensed the danger, reared back and guided Ethan away from the worst of the explosion's impact. That day, the horse had saved his life. Yet fate had been cruel. On a subsequent mission, Shadow was gravely injured by shrapnel and internal bleeding. The only humane choice was euthanasia. Ethan could still feel the weight of the reins in his hands, as the military veterinarian administered the lethal injection. He recalled the final flicker of Shadow's eyes, resignation mixed with trust, and how the horse had collapsed onto the ground. That was the moment something inside Ethan had shattered. In the 12 years since he had avoided going near horses, not wanting to bear the ache of that kind of connection again. But here he was under the scorching Texas sun, staring at another horse on the brink of collapse. The thought crossed his mind that if he walked away, no one would blame him. No one wanted this horse. Why would he, someone barely scraping by, take on such a burden? A man in overalls, presumably the auction staffer, leaned on the wooden fence. That one, he scoffed. Might as well let it go, for dog food ain't worth much. How much is it? Ethan asked, his voice low but unwavering. The staffer shrugged. 300 if you're feeling generous. I doubt anyone else is. A small group of buyers overheard and snickered. You serious? If you're lonely, find a dog, one of them joked. Another poked fun. Hey soldier boy, you sure you want a pile of bones? Might cost less to bury it. Ethan didn't respond to their laughter. He reached into his back pocket for his wallet, quietly counted his bills and handed them over. He signed the transfer form with a pen. The staffer provided, ignoring the man's incredulous stare. The group's jeers grew fainter in his ears, drowned out by his own heartbeat thudding heavily in his chest. He was doing something reckless, maybe even foolish, but it felt necessary. When the paperwork was settled, the staffer held out the worn rope halter that was looped around the horse's head. The creature lifted its head just a fraction, trembling as if sensing a shift in fortune. Ethan stepped forward, swallowing hard, and took the lead rope. The horse's cloudy eyes flicked toward his, and a tremor coursed through that bony frame. It was almost as if the animal realized it had been spared an unspeakable end, though not yet sure what that meant. Steering the horse away from the noisy main area, Ethan spoke just loudly enough for it to hear. All right, let's get you out of here. His voice was more gentle than he intended, his mind swirling with thoughts of Shadow. It took some effort to lead the horse through the maze of equipment and gawking onlookers. Some parted to let him pass. Others whispered or smirked behind his back. He ignored it all. Inside, part of him raged at the cruelty, but another part simply felt a strange calm, like he had stepped onto a path he was destined to take. He paused by the trailer he'd borrowed, as if making a final decision. Then quietly he leaned in and ran a hand along the horse's emaciated flank. Your name, he murmured, is Vala. The horse flinched slightly at his touch. Ethan continued softly. You'll need it, because sometimes you have to stand when everyone else says fall. That was how the battered horse left the Montgomery County Fairgrounds. Not with the pomp of a champion, but with a silent promise, made by a war veteran who couldn't bear to abandon another creature to the fate that once claimed his beloved Shadow. Late afternoon sun scorched the Amarillo plains as Ethan eased his borrowed trailer down a gravel driveway that led to Carter Ranch. Golden fields stretched around a dilapidated barn and a modest clapboard house with peeling paint. The high beams of sunlight turned everything into a washed-out haze, intensifying the sense of heat. Dust swirled around the tires as the truck slowed to a stop. Grace Carter, Ethan's wife, stepped out onto the porch. The look on her face spoke volumes, a mixture of shock, worry, and underlying fatigue. The ranch had seen better days, and so had their finances. She shielded her eyes from the glare. Ethan, she called with uncertainty. What did you bring home? Ethan climbed down from the driver's seat and gently opened the trailer. The creature inside was still trembling, skin drawn tight over its angular frame, wide eyes darting. With a coaxing gesture, Ethan led the horse down the ramp. Each clop of the hooves on metal echoed, as though heralding the arrival of something neither of them had been prepared for. Grace's jaw tightened. We're barely making it ourselves. We haven't even paid the last feed bill. She looked at the horse with a mixture of pity and exasperation. What do you call this? Ethan's voice was calm but firm. A chance for him, and maybe for me. Just then, a voice piped up from behind the house, and a skinny 10-year-old boy came racing around the corner. Dad, called Gavin, breathless from excitement. What's that? Did you buy a horse? Without waiting for an answer, he bounded closer, stopping short when he saw just how frail the animal was. Is he sick? Ethan bent down to ruffle the boy's hair. He's been neglected, not sick. Let's say no one believed he could make it, but I think we can change that. Gavin gazed at the horse, eyes full of concern and wonder. Valor, he repeated after hearing the name. Sounds like a superhero. A faint smile touched Ethan's face. In that moment, he realized how essential it was for Gavin to see this journey, how it might teach him about resilience and kindness in a way that words could never convey. At dinner, the tension in the small kitchen was palpable. A single overhead bulb cast a warm glow across the worn table. Grace served a simple meal of beans and cornbread, her lips pressed tight. For a while they ate in silence, the air thick with unspoken concerns. Finally, she set her fork down. "We can't pay the electric bill, the barn roof leaks, and you bring home this horse that looks like it could die any second." Ethan placed his own fork beside his plate, clasping his hands. "I once let a horse die in my hands because I had no choice. I'm not making that mistake again." Grace's eyes welled up, though she blinked hard to hold back tears. She knew he was speaking of Shadow, the story she'd heard only in fragments over the years. She wished she could empathize fully, but they had a ranch to keep afloat, a child to raise, and bills to pay. Logic told her this was reckless, yet she saw the determination in his eyes, a spark she hadn't seen in a very long time. Gavin cleared his throat, glancing between them. "Mom, Dad, are we gonna be okay?" Ethan turned to his son, forcing a reassuring smile. "We will be, bud. Just trust me." Night fell quickly in Amarillo, bringing with it a slight drop in temperature, but not enough to chase away the day's lingering heat. While Grace tucked Gavin in, Ethan lit a lantern and carried it outside. He surveyed the ramshackle barn they called a stable. There were holes in the roof, broken boards along one side, and a water trough that had started to rust. Valor stood tethered to a post, flinching at every small rustle of wind or scrape of wood. Ethan rummaged through a pile of old planks and bales of straw. With a resigned sigh, he set to work, hammering nails to reinforce the fence line, laying fresh straw on the barn floor, and filling a bucket with clean water. It was a scramble to patch up the space enough so that, as the hours dragged on, the moon rose, casting a milky light through the gaps in the barn's roof. Ethan could feel the sweat on his brow, the ache in his shoulders, and the stinging memory of Shadow's final moment. Time passed in a blur of small tasks. He replaced a loose hinge on the stall door, rearranged hay bales to create a cushioned corner, and made sure no jagged nails stuck out that might catch on Valor's coat. Finally, well past midnight, he gently led Valor into the stall. The horse was skittish, but no longer in a blind panic. Each step sent tremors through its bony frame. Ethan hung the lantern on a rusty hook, letting the soft glow illumine the broken creature. Valor's eyes darted around, then settled on Ethan in a silent plea. There was fear there, but also a faint glimmer of hope, or at least curiosity. For a second, Ethan was certain he saw Shadow's gaze superimposed on this gaunt figure. He blinked away the thought, reminding himself that this was a different life, a different horse. Kneeling down, he whispered, "You don't have to do anything except breathe. I'll handle the rest." For a moment, Valor's ears flicked forward as though he comprehended. Something in that brief exchange steeled Ethan's resolve. He set down a makeshift feed bucket filled with a small portion of oats and alfalfa, hoping it wouldn't upset the horse's weakened stomach. Then he rose, leaning against the stall door, staring at the shape of this fragile animal in the half-light. Behind him, the ranch was quiet save for the faint hiss of wind across the fields. Grace's exhaustion had lulled her to sleep, though no doubt her mind remained clouded with practical fear. Gavin was likely dreaming of grand adventures, oblivious to the financial strain. And Ethan stood watch as though on some midnight patrol, protecting a vulnerable ally from an invisible threat. The ranch might have been crumbling at the edges, the bank account worryingly thin, but there was a subtle force at work now, a spark of purpose that Ethan had long since lost. He couldn't articulate it yet, but he felt it in the way his chest tightened when he saw Valor wobble on those spindly legs. He felt it in the memory of a chestnut horse named Shadow, whose courage had once saved his life. Perhaps in saving this battered Mustang, he was also saving a forgotten part of himself. By the lantern's soft glow, Ethan gently touched Valor's mane. In that quiet, in the dusty corners of a neglected barn, under a Texas moon, a promise was made, one that only man and horse could share, a promise that they would try, no matter how foolish the world thought it might be. Morning light found its way through the flimsy boards of the barn, illuminating motes of dust that drifted lazily in the air. Outside, the sky still wore the pale hues of dawn, a faint blush of orange at the horizon. Ethan Carter had been up well before sunrise, an old habit from his military days. He carried a small bucket filled with hay, crushed oats, and a canteen of clean water. Slung over his shoulder was a pouch of antiseptic cream and a roll of gauze, the kind you'd usually keep from minor cuts or scrapes. Stepping into the stall, he found Valor upright, but visibly weak. The horse turned its head warily, ears flicking back at Ethan's approach. Over the last day, Valor's eyes had shown reluctance rather than outright terror, a subtle improvement. Ethan set the bucket down within reach, making sure to move slowly, so he wouldn't startle the animal. "Morning, big guy," he said softly. He watched as Valor lowered his muzzle and sniffed at the grain, pausing a moment before taking a tentative bite. A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "Glad to see you've still got an appetite." Ethan took mental notes of every small detail: how quickly Valor blinked, the rhythm of his breath, the quiver of his hind legs. On a scrap of paper tucked in his shirt pocket, he recorded times, amounts, and observations. Water intake, appetite, posture. This was how you monitored a wounded comrade in the field. Constant vigilance, leaning in with a clean rag dampened by warm water. He examined a large abrasion on Valor's left flank. The horse flinched, hooves scraping the straw-covered floor. "Easy," Ethan murmured, pressing the rag gently against the wound to clear away dried blood and debris. Valor let out a small grunt but didn't fight back. The smell of disinfectant always evoked certain memories for Ethan. The medical tents in Helmand Province were the stench of antiseptics mixed with sweat and gunpowder. He dabbed antibiotic ointment over the wound, careful not to press too hard. "Trust me," he said quietly, more to himself than to Valor. "I used to hate this smell too." He remembered how he'd grimaced at the sharp odor of rubbing alcohol when medics patched him up after a roadside bomb. Shadow had been there, stamping the ground as if impatient to move on, to keep Ethan safe. The memory caused an ache in his chest, and he closed his eyes, willing himself to stay in the present. By the time he'd finished cleaning the gash, the sun was higher in the sky. Valor had managed to eat most of the crushed oats, though slowly and in small mouthfuls. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Ethan soon fell into a routine. Each morning after tending to the rest of the ranch chores, he would spend at least half an hour simply sitting near Valor's stall. Sometimes he'd speak softly about mundane things: the weather forecast, the old tractor that refused to start, the fence he needed to mend. Other times he'd lapse into silence, letting Valor get used to the sound of his breathing and the quiet rustle of straw whenever he shifted position. By the third day, Ethan started telling fragments of his military experiences. He'd mentioned dusty storms in Helmand, or the long nights standing guard with nothing but an M4 across his lap. It was an odd sort of therapy, speaking these memories aloud to an animal that couldn't judge him, and yet it felt right. Perhaps because Valor too was learning to trust again. One afternoon, Ethan found himself recounting the story of Shadow, how the chestnut horse had saved him from a landmine, how unstoppable Shadow had seemed. "That old boy had more guts than any soldier I ever served with," he said with a mix of pride and sorrow. Then, without thinking, he addressed Valor as if it were Shadow, calling him by that name. "Shadow, you and I." He caught himself. Valor lifted his head, ears alert at the sound of the unfamiliar name. For a second, Ethan felt a painful squeeze in his chest. He placed a hand over his mouth, as if to stifle the slip of the tongue. "Sorry, Valor," he whispered after a long pause, his voice trembling. "I'm not over it yet." He leaned his forehead against the wooden stall gate, taking a moment to steady himself. The horse, sensing the shift in energy, blinked those cloudy eyes. There was no judgment in them, just a quiet presence. Word spread quickly in the tight-knit community that Ethan Carter had brought home some half-dead Mustang. In places like Amarillo, gossip traveled faster than tumbleweeds on a windy day. By the time a week passed, it was the main topic at the Rusty Spur Bar, a dimly lit hole in the wall where ranchers and farmhands congregated after sunset. The chatter was far from sympathetic. "That ex-soldier's a fool," one man snorted, leaning against the polished bar top. "He's got a ranch that's practically fallen apart now. He's taken in strays like some dog shelter." Another chimed in, "I heard that horse is so skinny a gust of wind might blow it over." A third voice, thick with mockery, added, "He's even got a superhero name for it. Valor, they say. What's next? A cape." Someone else took a swig of beer and muttered, "More must have rattled his brains. That's what happens when you see too much." They laughed, A mixture of ignorance and a certain small-town cynicism. No one bothered to consider that maybe Ethan wasn't just saving a horse. Maybe he was saving himself. Inside the Carter home, the tension grew. Grace sat at the kitchen table flipping through a small ledger where she kept track of expenses. Horse feed, bedding, straw, antiseptic gels, and the cost of materials to fix the barn. The numbers refused to add up favorably. She let out a sigh, rubbing her temple. "We're running low on everything," she said to Ethan's retreating back, as he hefted a bucket of water out the door. "You can't just keep pouring money into this." He paused at the threshold, turning his head slightly. "I already lost one life I cared about because I didn't fight hard enough," he said in a steady, quiet voice. "I'm not letting that happen again." Grace stared after him. She'd heard traces of this determination before. The passion in his eyes was the same as on their wedding day, when he swore to protect her from anything life threw their way. Only now it was fueled by regret and a longing she couldn't fully comprehend. She felt both admiration and fear. When Ethan reached the barn, he sat down the bucket and glanced back. He could see Grace silhouetted in the doorway, arms folded as if trying to keep herself together. He turned away again, stepping into Valor's stall. Tending to the horse was easier than facing the weight of Grace's words. At least with Valor, everything was straightforward. Wound care, feeding, gentle words. The horse needed him, and for once he felt useful. In Grace's eyes that evening, he saw a flicker of confusion, perhaps even sorrow, but overshadowing it was something else. A spark he recognized as light. Maybe, just maybe, bringing this horse home was the only way he could bring himself back to life too. A week crawled by. Early one morning, Ethan pushed open the barn door as sunlight slanted through the gaps, dust drifting in illuminated beams. He found Valor standing with a bit more stability, neck held a fraction higher than before. The horse's eyes, once as dull as tarnished metal, held a faint gleam. When Ethan offered a fresh bucket of water, Valor didn't recoil. Instead, he took a couple of tentative steps forward, hooves scraping the concrete floor. For the first time, Ethan thought the horse might actually be meeting him halfway. He exhaled slowly and felt his heart lighten. "Good job, buddy," he whispered, fingers tightening on the handle of the bucket. "You're doing just fine." It was a small milestone. A horse taking a couple of steps, but for Ethan it felt monumental. He carefully checked Valor's body condition. The protruding ribs were still painfully visible and the horse's coat remained patchy, but he seemed slightly more alert. Perhaps the daily feed and gentle care were starting to make a difference. Later that same afternoon, Ethan was brushing Valor's coat with a soft curry comb when Gavin tiptoed in. For a few seconds, the boy simply watched from the entrance, as though mustering the courage to interrupt his father. "Dad?" he finally asked. "Can I help?" Ethan paused, turning to look at Gavin. There was a flash of surprise in his eyes. In the past week, the boy had been around Valor, but kept a respectful distance. Now here he was, stepping in with a shy but determined stance. Ethan handed him the brush, pointing to Valor's flank. "Rush in gentle circular motions, and let him sniff your hand first so he knows you're a friend." Gavin swallowed and approached slowly, extending his palm. Valor snorted softly, ears twitching, then lowered his head to take in the boy's scent. Encouraged by that acceptance, Gavin started brushing. His motions were awkward at first, but he took great care not to press too hard. It didn't take long for Gavin to settle into a rhythm, humming a little tune as he worked. Occasionally, he tossed nervous glances at Ethan, who just watched with a nod of approval. Over the following days, Gavin came out to the barn almost every afternoon after school. He'd read aloud from a battered children's book about cowboys or quietly recount the day's events. Math class, recess soccer games. The friend who annoyed him, Valor, would stand and listen, occasionally flicking an ear or shifting a hoof. Though the horse's reaction was minimal, it was enough to show that Valor recognized Gavin's presence. "Dad, do you think he likes me?" Gavin asked one evening as the sun set behind them, painting the barn in warm golden light. "I think he's learning to," Ethan replied, patting Valor's shoulder, "and that's the best start we can hope for." One night, well past Gavin's bedtime, Ethan peered out the kitchen window and saw a small shape curled up near Valor's stall. Alarmed, he rushed outside only to find Gavin dozing against a bale of hay. The boy must have sneaked out to check on the horse and fallen asleep there. Crouching down, Ethan gently shook Gavin's shoulder. The boy stirred, blinking up at his father with sleepy eyes. "I just wanted to say good night to him," Gavin mumbled, embarrassed. "Didn't mean to fall asleep." Ethan offered him a half smile. "Let's get you inside before your mom notices." Gavin rubbed his eyes, glancing at Valor in the dim light. He's gonna be okay, right? Ethan nodded, helping his son to his feet. He's doing better each day, and so are we. Once Gavin was tucked back into bed, Ethan lingered in the doorway. He could feel an unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a quiet sense of possibility. For so long, he'd been carrying the weight of Shadow's memory alone. Now he was sharing something meaningful with his son, forging a bond that had nothing to do with regrets and everything to do with hope. Closing Gavin's bedroom door, he spoke softly into the night air. "You won't grow up with all my silences, Valor. Thank you for that." For the first time since returning from the war, Ethan felt he was building something more than just fences around a worn-down ranch. He was passing along a bit of resilience, showing Gavin that life's greatest battles often happen far from any battlefield. And sometimes, they're the ones you fight in your own heart. A few mornings later, the low rumble of an engine cut through the quiet ranch. Ethan lifted his head from the trough he was cleaning and spotted an ancient pickup truck, its paint rusted and peeling, rattling to a stop by the front fence. Out climbed a tall, lean man with a shock of white hair and a deep-set gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. "Howdy," he called, leaning on a wooden cane as he made his way forward. "You'd be Carter, right? Name's Buckley. Heard you picked up a bag of bones from the fair." Ethan gave a short nod. "That's right." Mr. Buckley didn't smile or grimace. He simply tilted his head in the direction of the barn. "Mind if I take a look?" Without waiting for a reply, he marched onward, cane tapping the ground in a brisk rhythm. Ethan followed, intrigued. Inside the barn, Valor raised his head warily at the intrusion. Buckley paused, eyes narrowing as he studied the horse's legs, coat, and posture in a single sweeping glance. "Rough shape," he muttered. "But I've seen worse." Then he shook his head. "Might have some slight misalignment in the back. Likely from poor hoof care." Ethan, arms folded, watched him carefully. There was something reassuring in the old man's brisk manner, like he'd been around horses his entire life and never gave up on one without a fight. Buckley walked back to his truck and pulled out an assortment of well-worn tools, a rasp, nippers, a hoof knife, and a small anvil. "If it's all right, I'll have a look at this fellow's feet. No point letting him stumble around if we can fix it." Caught off guard by the man's forwardness, Ethan simply nodded. "I appreciate that." Buckley went to work with remarkable gentleness, for someone who looked so gruff. He approached Valor's hind leg calmly, letting the horse sniff his sleeve before carefully lifting the hoof. Despite his aches and advanced age, the old man's hands were sure and steady. He trimmed the overgrown edges, rasped down uneven surfaces, and tested for any sign of pain or infection. Valor snorted a few times, shifting uneasily, but Buckley held on with quiet patience. "Easy there, boy," he murmured. "We're getting you back on your feet." An hour later, when he finally set his tools down, Buckley wiped his brow with a stained handkerchief. "Well, he's no racehorse, but he'll stand straighter now." Ethan felt a wave of gratitude welling in his chest. "Thank you. I'm not sure how to repay you. Don't fret. Just make sure he keeps walking." Buckley's gaze swept the barn. "You're doing the right thing, Carter, even if it don't look like it now." It wasn't a compliment, it sounded more like a statement of fact, and for some reason, that meant more to Ethan than any praise could have. From the kitchen window, Grace had been observing the whole process. She saw Ethan leading Valor in slow circles around the yard to test the newly trimmed hooves. The horse's gait remained uneven, but the stumbling had lessened. Even from a distance, it was clear that Valor's posture was improved, less swaying with each step. As Ethan guided the horse, his focus was absolute, every nerve alive to the small shifts in Valor's balance. Grace's heart constricted. She remembered a time when Ethan had lost that look in his eyes, somewhere between the day he came home from Afghanistan and the months afterward, when he barely spoke. But now, he radiated an intense presence, the kind that said he was willing to keep fighting for something no one else believed in. That evening, when Ethan stepped into the house for supper, Grace turned to him and said softly, "He can walk better now, can't he?" He glanced over his shoulder, hearing Valor's faint hoof scrape from the yard. "Yeah," he replied, "and tomorrow we'll see if he can go even farther." For the first time in a while, there was no underlying tension in her voice, no protest on her lips. Instead, a seed of acceptance had taken root. Maybe it was because she saw how others, like Mr. Buckley, were quietly supporting this rescue. Or maybe it was because she glimpsed the change in Ethan, the stirring of a purpose she recognized from the day she'd fallen in love with him. In that small kitchen, under the soft glow of a single ceiling lamp, Something unspoken passed between them, a fragile understanding that not every hope had to be logical, to be worth chasing. Several days after Mr. Buckley trimmed Valor's hooves, Ethan decided it was time for another step forward. Early one crisp morning, he stood outside the stable with a faded blanket tucked under his arm, worn at the edges but still serviceable. Valor eyed him warily as he approached. The morning sun highlighted the horse's ribs beneath a still, lusterless coat, yet there was a quiet alertness that hadn't been there before. Ethan draped the blanket across Valor's back, taking extra care to move slowly. At first, Valor startled. He jerked his hind legs as if warding off an unseen threat. His head tossed from side to side, nostrils flaring in panic. Rather than shouting or yanking the halter, Ethan gently slipped the blanket off and laid a calming hand on Valor's neck. "Easy," he murmured, voice steady. "You're not Shadow. You don't need to be him, just be yourself." He stroked Valor's withers, letting the horse feel the warmth of his palm. Valor trembled but did not bolt. On the third attempt that morning, the horse allowed the blanket to rest across his back for a scant few seconds before shuddering and stepping away. It wasn't much, but Ethan recognized it as a victory, a small, crucial sign that Valor was beginning to trust. 2 more sessions passed in similar fashion, each one lasting no longer than 10 or 15 minutes. By the third day, Valor stood still for a full 3 minutes with the blanket on his back, breathing in shallow but even rhythms. Ethan finally exhaled in relief. "That's it, buddy, we'll take it slow." He removed the blanket with the same gentleness and offered Valor a small treat, a sliver of carrot that Gavin had insisted on buying at the feed store. Valor sniffed it warily, then took the morsel. Soft acceptance, free of fear. The next phase of training involved leading Valor around the edge of the ranch where the ground was softer and green shoots still sprouted. On a mild afternoon, Ethan bridled Valor with a light halter. He carried no whip or spurs, just a simple lid rope and his voice. Whenever Valor stumbled, Ethan stopped and waited, never pulling or jerking. He used brief commands: walk, stop, easy. The first circuit was clumsy. Valor's knees buckled more than once, and each time he trembled as though expecting punishment. Instead, Ethan simply rested a hand on Valor's shoulder, giving the horse time to regain composure. Day after day, they repeated the routine. Gavin sometimes watched from a distance, perched on a fence post, offering a small cheer when Valor managed a few additional steps without faltering. It took nearly a week before Valor could manage a full circle around the yard without stumbling. One afternoon, Gavin started up to them, clapping his hands in excitement. "Dad, he's doing it! He's not falling!" Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, a grin crossing his face. "He's still shaky, son, but he's beginning to trust his own legs." Gavin tilted his head, curious. "Is that all it takes? Just walking in circles?" Ethan ruffled his son's hair. "Sometimes the smallest steps forward can mean the biggest changes inside." The progress was slow but meaningful. Each careful lap seemed to boost Valor's confidence, and each day he required fewer pauses. The horse's ears twitched less at sudden sounds, his eyes flicking to Ethan for guidance rather than rolling back in fear. On the 7th day, they completed a clean loop without Valor's knees giving out once. Gavin whooped with delight, waving from his vantage point. Ethan responded with a subdued smile. "Not perfect yet," he murmured, "but it's a start." That same evening, after the sun sank below the plains, Ethan lingered in the barn. He draped the blanket across his arm again, more out of habit than necessity, and observed Valor's silhouette under the dim glow of a single overhead bulb. Memory wove through his mind the vivid image of Shadow, that fearless warhorse, bold and headstrong. In contrast, Valor was hesitant, gentle, and prone to fright. Yet in the horse's eyes now flickered a spirit reminiscent of Shadow's own. Resolute spark. Ethan spoke quietly. "I used to think I needed you to be Shadow, but you're not him, and that's all right." He let the words hang, the barn enveloped in silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of straw under Valor's hooves. Reaching up, Ethan rested a hand lightly against Valor's neck. "You're learning to trust, aren't you?" He allowed himself a bittersweet smile. "And I'm learning to let go." He stood there for a long moment, letting the hush of the barn seep into his bone. In Valor's presence, he felt a strange release, like shedding the husk of guilt that had clung to him ever since Shadow's final breath. He would never forget that chestnut warhorse. But perhaps, in helping Valor reclaim life, Ethan was releasing himself from a promise he once thought he'd failed to keep. News of an upcoming exhibition made its way onto the town's public bulletin board. Amarillo Autumn Showcase Friendly Horse Exhibition. It wasn't a competition per se, no prizes for speed or skill. Instead, the event celebrated the connection between horse and rider, focusing on basic commands and partnership. Ethan spotted the flyer on a trip into town for feed. He eyed it thoughtfully. The crisp paper pinned over a host of other announcements, bake sales, rummage markets, and job postings. At first he hesitated. The idea of bringing Valor before a crowd triggered an old tension in his chest. Still, the simplest route to overcoming fear was facing it head-on. Later that day, he stopped by the local community center, filling out the necessary form to register. He wrote Valor under the section labeled horse name, half expecting the clerk to raise an eyebrow. Instead, she smiled politely and handed him a receipt. When he got back home and told Gavin, the boy nearly exploded with excitement. "We're gonna show them Valor, right, Dad? Everyone'll see how far he's come." Ethan patted his son's shoulder. "We're gonna let him try, yeah, but don't expect a showstopper, son. This is just so he learns not to fear people." Gavin nodded, though a gleam in his eyes betrayed his boundless hope. "I'm gonna clap really loud for him." On the morning of the showcase, the grassy field behind the town's community hall was bustling with activity. Owners and trainers readied their horses under temporary awnings, polished saddles, leather halters, bright ribbons. Everywhere one looked, there was a display of grooming and pride. Ethan wore a plain white shirt, its sleeves rolled to the elbows, and an old cowboy hat he'd found stuffed in the back of the closet. He led Valor on a simple lead rope. The horse's coat still bore signs of malnourishment, but at least his stance was steadier, his eyes more alert. In stark contrast, other participants arrived with shiny thoroughbreds or sleek quarter horses sporting expensive tack. A few onlookers paused to stare, some with pity, others with mild amusement. "Hey, whose horse is that?" a voice murmured from somewhere behind. "That's Carter's," answered another. "You know, the ex-soldier with the half-dead Mustang. He's bringing that here. Maybe he's looking for sympathy." Valor twitched his ears at the rising chatter, hooves scraping the turf as he glanced wildly around. Ethan felt the tension in the lead rope, the familiar tremor in Valor's shoulders. He patted the horse's neck, hoping to soothe him. "Easy now," he murmured. "Don't mind the crowd." Someone snickered, "Poor thing. He can't possibly think that Neg's ready to show." Gavin, standing nearby with a bag of feed, overheard the mockery. His gaze darted to Ethan, who wore a calm expression, refusing to engage with the whispers. Yet beneath that calm, he felt the old anger flare, the same frustration he experienced when people wrote off something he believed in. Valor's tail flicked nervously, and he jerked his head as if wanting to spin around and run. The shifting crowd and loudspeakers tested his fragile confidence. Ethan exhaled, fighting the urge to turn back. They were here now, and Valor needed this challenge. Just as a fresh wave of whispers began, Gavin stepped forward. He was wearing a t-shirt with a cartoon horse printed on the front, a small detail he'd insisted on. Moving to stand next to Valor, Gavin raised his voice, though it quavered slightly. "My dad believes in Valor, and so do I." It was a simple statement, not shouted or angry, but it cut through the murmurs like a whip crack. Ethan blinked at his son. In that instant, he realized he wasn't alone in this quiet battle. Gavin, too, had put his heart into seeing Valor succeed. A handful of people looked away uncomfortably. The hush was brief but potent. The tension in the air seemed to recede just a little, leaving room for something else, curiosity perhaps, or at least a willingness to watch. Ethan cleared his throat, ruffling Gavin's hair. "All right then, let's do this." When their turn came, Ethan led Valor onto the makeshift field. There were no fancy maneuvers or daring feats. The announcer explained that each pair would demonstrate basic guidance: walking, stopping, turning, showcasing the relationship between horse and handler. The Valor started out stiffly, ears swiveling nervously, but each time Ethan uttered a soft command, "Walk, easy, turn," the horse responded, albeit hesitantly. They moved in a slow circle, then wove around a small set of cones, and stopped at a designated line. The entire routine lasted only a few minutes, but it required every ounce of Valor's courage. A hush fell over the spectators. Perhaps they expected a spectacle, or maybe they had come to see a comedic failure. Instead, they witnessed a fragile, earnest partnership in the making. No one laughed, no one heckled. Instead, the tension turned to a kind of collective silence, as though the crowd understood the delicacy of the moment. When Ethan gently cued Valor to pivot and give a small bow, really just lowering his head politely, someone began to clap in the back. Soon, the applause spread, growing into a standing ovation. Gavin, watching from the edge, cheered so loudly his voice cracked. He turned to Grace, who stood nearby with her hands clasped under her chin, tears glistening in her eyes. Even Miss Buckley appeared at a distance, leaning on his cane, a hint of a nod passing across his rugged features. As Ethan and Valor walked off the field, a little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, that horse listens with its eyes," she said, wonder coloring her voice. Ethan couldn't help but overhear. He felt an unspoken gratitude flood him. Maybe this was only a small local showcase, but for Valor and for Ethan, it was the first time they'd ever stood together in front of strangers, without fear or shame. After all the participants finished their demonstrations, the announcer stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, waiting for closing remarks. In a steady voice, the announcer began. "Today has been about celebrating the bond between horse and handler. Not just about skill, and this year we've decided to introduce a special award, one we're calling the Spirit of Second Chances." A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. This wasn't in the program. Usually the Amarillo Autumn Showcase ended with polite applause and maybe a group photo. The announcer cleared his throat. "This award isn't for the most well-trained horse or the most impressive technique. It's for demonstrating courage in the face of adversity and the power of belief when others have already given up." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We'd like to present it to Ethan Carter and his horse Valor." There was a collective intake of breath. Then a swell of applause. People craned their necks, searching for Ethan in the crowd. For a moment he stood rooted to the spot, stunned. He felt Valor shift at his side. Sensing the sudden commotion, Gavin ran up to Ethan, eyes shining. "Dad, go!" Grace was only steps behind, tears threatening to spill as she nudged him forward. Ethan guided Valor to a small wooden platform, where the announcer extended a plaque etched with the words, "The Spirit of Second Chances." Ethan accepted it with trembling hands. He glanced at the metal plate, the reflection of his own weathered face staring back. Holding back a surge of emotion, he rested his free hand on Valor's neck, feeling the steady warmth that reminded him this horse was alive. Alive and standing beside him. "We did it," he whispered, voice thick. "We didn't have to win first place. We just had to make." Gavin dashed onto the platform and flung his arms around Ethan's waist, burying his face against his father's shirt. Ethan felt a single tear roll down and land in Gavin's hair. The boy looked up, grinning. In that shared moment, all the trials, Shadow's loss, the sleepless nights, the barn repairs, faded into the background. The crowd cheered with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the earlier skepticism. Some clapped politely. Others hollered enthusiastic congratulations. A few folks who had once ridiculed Ethan now found themselves nodding in genuine respect. As Ethan and Valor stepped down, he noticed Miss Buckley at the far edge of the gathering, leaning on his cane. Their eyes met, and the old man raised his chin in a subtle gesture of approval. Next to him, Grace stood with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes red but shining. She reached for Gavin's hand, holding it tight. "I'm so proud of both of you," she managed to say, voice trembling. Nearby, a young mother guided her child closer to Valor, curiosity in their faces. The child gazed at the horse, who was still panting from the adrenaline of being in the spotlight. Carefully, Ethan let the child stroke Valor's muzzle. The horse twitched but didn't pull away. "That's all he needed," Ethan murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Someone to believe in him again. And in that moment, they stood on the grass under the late afternoon sun, a snapshot of renewal. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was undeniably real. The kind of hope that quietly takes root once you water it with patience and care. A few days after the showcase, life at the Carter Ranch settled back into its gentle rhythm. Valor roamed the paddock with a slow but confident gait. Gavin helped Ethan muck out the stalls, humming the same tune he'd brushed Valor to. Grace kept an eye on household finances, though she now did so with a little less anxiety, buoyed by the goodwill they'd received at the event. Late one morning, a flashy pickup truck with polished chrome wheels rumbled down the driveway. Out stepped a tall, clean-shaven man dressed in immaculate Western attire, pressed jeans, a gleaming belt buckle, and a hat that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Calvin Boyd, a name known around these parts as a prosperous horse breeder and business savant, strode confidently toward Ethan. "I heard about you at the Amarillo Autumn Showcase," Boyd began, scanning the property with practiced cool. "Seems you've done the impossible with that scrawny Mustang." Ethan folded his arms. Suspicious. He's not scrawny anymore. But yeah, he's come a long way. A faint smile curved Boyd's lips. I see potential. More than potential, actually. I see a great story. People love a good underdog. I'm willing to pay 10 times what you spent at the fair. Grace, who had just stepped onto the porch, froze. The sum Boyd offered was jaw-dropping, enough to ease their financial burdens for a good while. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing, his expression unreadable. Boyd took that as a cue to press forward. I'm thinking media coverage, maybe. Magazine features about a rescued Mustang turned star. We both win. Grace bit her lower lip, her thoughts an internal whirlwind. Boyd's offer could fix the roof, settle the overdue bills, buy feed for months. She caught Ethan's gaze, silently asking him what he planned to do. Boyd returned later that evening, hoping to close the deal, but he found Ethan standing by the barn with arms crossed and a resolute glint in his eye. I appreciate the offer, Ethan said, voice steady, but I'm not selling valor. Boyd raised a brow. You do realize how much money you stand to gain. You could salvage this place, maybe expand. Ethan's jaw tightened. Memories of Shadow flooded his mind. The day he'd been forced to let that horse go without a proper fight. He wouldn't repeat that mistake. I once had a horse I cared about, he said slowly, his voice low, and I let him die because I didn't have a choice. This time, I do have a choice, and I'm not giving valor up for any price. Boyd tried another tactic. I can give him a better stable, professional training. He could be a real star. Ethan shook his head. Maybe, but valor's not an investment. He's something I promised myself to protect. If he ends up a star, it'll be on his own terms, not yours. A flicker of frustration crossed Boyd's face. After another moment of attempted persuasion, he threw up his hands. All right, Carter, I won't push it, but when you come to your senses, you know where to find me. As Boyd walked away, the sun dipping low in the sky, Ethan felt an enormous sense of relief. He hadn't hesitated, not even for a sec. Valor was more than just a horse. He was the living embodiment of a second chance for both of them. Unbeknownst to them, Gavin had been crouching behind a stack of hay bales, listening to every word. He watched Boyd leave, tires kicking up small stones, then turned to see his father still standing resolute, the last rays of sunlight catching the streaks of gray in his hair. That evening, as Ethan came in for dinner, Gavin tugged at his sleeve. Dad, he whispered, I heard what you told Miss Boyd. You could have gotten a lot of money. Ethan placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Some things aren't for sale, no matter the price. Gavin nodded, understanding, dawning in his young eyes. Like valor? Exactly, Ethan said softly, glancing toward the barn. There's a reason we called him that. It means courage, heart, things you can't put a price tag on. For a moment, Gavin just stood there, as if soaking in the gravity of those words. Then he smiled, a subtle grin that said he was proud of his dad. In that shared silence, Ethan realized how deeply Gavin was learning from this journey. Lessons of compassion, loyalty, and the resilience of holding on to hope when the world says to let go. A few days after the Amarillo Autumn Showcase, Ethan Carter found himself in front of his small home, leaning on the fence at dusk. The horizon glowed a soft orange, fading into a tranquil purple. He allowed himself a moment to absorb the hush of twilight before heading inside. It had been a surprisingly peaceful week, but he could sense the stir of something new in the air, an undercurrent of curiosity and goodwill taking root within the local community. Indeed, the next morning proved him right. Over breakfast, Grace placed a copy of the Amarillo Gazette on the table. Have you seen this? She asked softly. Gavin peered over the rim of his cereal bowl, and Ethan set down his coffee mug to pick up the paper. There it was, a short article tucked into the lifestyle section titled "Saved by a Veteran's Faith, the Horse No One Wants." It recapped the story of Ethan and Valor's performance at the showcase, highlighting the odds they'd overcome. He raised an eyebrow. I didn't realize anyone was paying attention, he murmured. Gavin beamed, proud of his father and the horse they'd rescued. Over the next few days, the ripple effects of that article became apparent. A neighbor from 2 miles down the road stopped by, dropping off a small sack of oats with an encouraging note. for the horse who found hope. Another local woman arrived with a donation of second-hand tack, a bridle, stirrups, and an old but solid halter. People Ethan had never met came forth with items they thought might help. Rolls of bandages, a bag of supplements, warm blankets for the night. One evening as the sun dipped low, he discovered a bundle left at the ranch gate. A large bag of feed wrapped in burlap, a note pinned to the front that read simply, "For the man who wouldn't give up." When Ethan knelt down to pick it up, he felt his hands tremble. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the realization that he was no longer fighting this battle alone. Something about Valor's story had touched the townsfolk, inspiring them to rally around a unassuming man and his once-forgotten horse. Standing there by the gate, he swallowed hard, the note crinkling gently in his grasp. This was more than charity. It was a symbol that the community believed in them now. Grace watched from the porch, smiling wistfully, her own heart lightening at the sight. It was the first time she'd seen Ethan's eyes soften like that since he'd come home from the war. Early one crisp morning, Ethan was crouched beside Valor, carefully examining the horse's hooves. He wanted to ensure they remained balanced after Mr. Buckley's work. He was so focused that he almost missed the sound of an approaching engine. When he glanced up, he recognized the battered pickup truck pulling into the driveway. It belonged to Zach Miller, the same man who'd once sneered at Ethan in the rusty spur bar. Zach stepped out slowly, kicking the dust from his boots. He carried a bundle of wooden poles and a coil of rope. His cheeks were flushed, perhaps from the chilly air or from discomfort at being here. Walking over, he cleared his throat. "Heard you might need some training equipment. My old man had these lying around. Thought you could use them if you want." Ethan stood brushing straw off his worn jeans. He was momentarily at a loss for words. Months ago, Zach had been one of those who ridiculed him. Yet now here he stood, eyes flicking anywhere but Ethan's face, offering to help. "Thanks," Ethan said simply, keeping his tone calm. "I appreciate it." Zach nodded, setting the gear down near the barn. They fell into an easy rhythm of work without much talk, Ethan holding a measuring tape while Zach hammered a makeshift wooden frame for a training corral. Occasionally their eyes met, but neither man seemed eager to discuss the tension that used to stand between them. When they'd finished, Zach tugged at the brim of his cap. "I guess I was wrong about you," he admitted, voice low. "If you need someone to hold the post or run a timer when you train that horse for the big competition, just call me." Ethan nodded. "Will do," he said, "and thanks for coming around." Zach offered the faintest of smiles, then climbed back into his truck and rumbled away. As he watched the vehicle disappear, Ethan felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Valor's story wasn't just changing the horse, it was changing the people around them too. The season was inching closer to late autumn when Ethan learned of the Tri-County Mustang Trials, a prestigious event where riders and owners from 3 neighboring counties came to compete. Unlike the casual showcase in Amarillo, this event demanded rigorous tests of skill and bravery, from obstacle courses to handling drills under loud distractions. Ethan sat on the porch one evening, spiral notebook on his lap. He scribbled out a training schedule, systematically listing exercises for Valor, balancing on uneven ground, trotting in circles with controlled speed, desensitizing to sudden sounds or flapping tarps. His thoughts drifted to the day he'd first seen Valor, trembling and starved, and he marveled at how far they'd come. Gavin, now an eager partner in all ranch activities, took on the role of trainer. He polished the tack, counted seconds with a stopwatch, and offered Valor small treats after each session. Every evening, the boy would read out a new horse care tip he'd found in a library book, eyes shining with excitement. About a week before the competition, Ethan decided to show Valor the event grounds, or at least the sign marking its entrance. It was an old wooden post standing beside a broad dirt road painted with bold letters, Tri-County Mustang Trial. Next Saturday, he parked the truck, walked Valor over carefully, and let the horse sniff the base of the sign as the wind tossed leaves around them. "This isn't about winning," Ethan murmured, resting a hand on Valor's mane. "It's just about proving we can stand in the light without fear." The horse flicked its ears as though listening. Behind them, Gavin quietly stepped out of the truck, gazing at the sign with an odd mixture of excitement and awe. They headed back to the ranch with a renewed sense of purpose. In the following days, Ethan woke at the crack of dawn to fine-tune Valor's movements, reinforcing clear verbal commands, practicing sudden stops, and navigating simple obstacles. He didn't expect miracles, but he wanted Valor to be as prepared as possible for whatever lay ahead. On the eve of the competition, Grace served a warm supper and silently refilled Ethan's coffee cup. She touched his arm gently, her eyes saying more than words could convey. She was proud of him, even if she worried about how the event might unfold. That night, Ethan checked on Valor in the barn, stroking the horse's forehead under the lantern light. The stable had never looked so inviting. Piles of fresh hay, a repaired roof, and a sense that tomorrow would mark a pivotal chapter in both their lives. The Tri-County Mustang trials took place in a sprawling open-air stadium, nestled in a valley framed by rugged hills. Flags bearing sponsor logos fluttered on tall poles. Rows of seats surrounded a central arena, where dust swirled under the bright sun, and speakers crackled with announcements to the arriving crowd. Ethan guided his old truck into a crowded parking area, lined with horse trailers of every shape and size. Sleek black thoroughbreds, muscular quarter horses, and speckled Appaloosas were being unloaded all around, each sporting glossy coats and professional braiding. Their owners wore pristine Western attire, hats angled just right, boots polished. By contrast, Ethan's hat was sun-faded and shapeless, and Valor, though improved, still showed signs of his difficult past. His coat bore old scars, his ribs weren't as pronounced as before, but they remained visible beneath a modest layer of muscle. While Ethan unlatched the trailer, Gavin hopped out of the truck, wide-eyed at the spectacle. "Dad, look at that," he breathed, watching a towering black gelding stomp the ground, muscles rippling. Another contestant walked by, leading a high-stepping bay, more than ready for the competition. Valor shifted in the trailer, uncertain. Ethan sensed the horse's anxiety at the cacophony of sounds. Loudspeakers, horses neighing in protest, people shouting instructions. Placing a hand on Valor's neck, he whispered, "We've faced worse. Let them gawk if they want. Today, we only need to beat our own doubt." They moved to a designated prep area. A few onlookers glanced at Valor, some with mild pity, others with a grudging respect, that said, "I remember that horse from Amarillo." Soft murmurs floated through the air. "Is that the same horse? Man, he's got guts bringing it here. Didn't think it would be stable enough for something like this." Ethan blocked out the chatter, focusing on adjusting Valor's tack. He whispered calming words, each phrase measured and soothing. Grace and Gavin hovered near the fence. Gavin gave Ethan an enthusiastic thumbs up, while Grace folded her arms protectively, her lips pressed together in silent encouragement. The trials were divided into multiple segments. In the first round, each horse had to traverse a line of flags flapping in the wind, a test of composure in unpredictable situations. When it came their turn, Ethan led Valor to the arena's starting point. The wind picked up, making the flags snap with sharp crack. Valor snorted and jerked his head, but Ethan steadied him with the lead rope. "Walk on," Ethan commanded softly. The horse's ears pinned back briefly, but he took a step forward, another step, then another, each one accompanied by the flags rattling over. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation. A few recognized the pair from the showcase and whispered to one another in subdued awe. Though Valor's gait was tense, he never bolted. By the time they reached the end of the row of flags, the announcer marked a clear run. No breaks in rhythm, no disqualification. Applause rippled through the stands, overshadowed by the hollers from a nearby group of supporters. Among them, Zach Miller lifted his hat, letting out a proud whistle. The second round involved weaving through a series of low obstacles. Many horses trotted confidently, hooves clipping the edges of the rails with practiced ease. Valor, less sure of his stride, took it slowly. Ethan could feel the horse's hesitation, but each time Valor stumbled, Ethan paused, letting him regain balance before continuing. They finished the course with no major faults. Certainly not the fastest time, but also not the last. By the third round, the stands had grown quieter in a shifting sort of respect. People who had once sneered no longer found it amusing. This stage tested obedience under loudspeakers blasting recorded gunshots and cheering noises. Horses had to halt, pivot, and back up upon vocal command. The clamor crackled through the speakers, startling more than a few contestants. Yet Valor managed to remain composed. He flinched at the bursts of noise but obeyed Ethan's soft cues. Stop, turn, back, and executed each movement with surprising precision. Tears emerged from a corner of the arena. Ethan recognized Mr. Buckley, leaning against a railing, arms folded, nodding slowly. Gavin stood on the lower bleachers, clapping so hard his palms turned red. Grace was beside him, a hand pressed to her heart as if it might burst with pride. By the time round 3 ended, the pair had earned modest but consistent scores, surpassing the expectations of many who had pegged Valor as an also-ran. As the sun arced overhead, the tension in the stadium thickened. The final challenge was an extreme trail test, a patch of uneven sand that behaved like quicksand in spots, followed by a low wooden barrier and a short, steep incline. Horses had to navigate this tricky terrain without spooking or getting stuck. Ethan brought Valor to the starting line. He felt the horse quiver beneath his touch, ears splayed. The memory of Shadow's ordeal rose unbidden in Ethan's mind. The day that valiant warhorse had died, the day Ethan felt he hadn't fought enough to save him. A trembling fear nudged his gut. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and turned his full attention to Valor. "You've faced worse, old boy," he whispered. "Shadow once ran through fire to save me, but all you need to do is take one step." The official signaled for them to proceed. Valor advanced, each hoof pressing tentatively into the sand. Almost immediately, the front right leg sank halfway up the fetlock, making the horse jerk its head in alarm. Some spectators sucked in anxious breaths, bracing for a meltdown, but Ethan resisted the urge to yank the rein. He simply placed a comforting hand on Valor's neck, letting the horse feel his calm presence. "It's fine," he murmured. "Just a few more steps." The crowd watched in mere silence. Gavin's fists were clenched so tightly, his knuckles bled. Grace quietly gripped the railing, a silent prayer on her lips. Valor hesitated again, sinking slightly deeper. The ground was spongy, shifting dangerously. Ethan locked eyes with the horse, voice barely above a whisper. Shadow faced flames. "You just have to move forward." One heartbeat passed, then two. With a shudder, Valor snorted and lifted his front leg, muscles straining against the pull of the sand. Step by step they inched forward. Each time Valor threatened to falter, Ethan remained unwavering, using gentle pressure and soft words. Finally they reached more solid ground, the horse's chest and flanks coated in streaks of damp sand. They still had to clear a low wooden rail and ascend a short incline to finish the course. By now, though, Valor's adrenaline seemed to be working in his favor. He took the rail at a careful half step, bumping it but not knocking it over. The watchers grew louder in encouragement, many standing to cheer. Then came the final slope, a narrow ramp up the side of the arena's bank. Valor panted, sides heaving, but he pressed on. With Ethan at his side, they ascended until they reached the top. There was a moment of stunned quiet. Then applause washed over them. No wild roars, but a heartfelt, resonant ovation. People recognized they had witnessed something more than a technical feat. They had witnessed an act of sheer determination and trust between a man and his once broken horse. Ethan stroked Valor's neck, murmuring a soft thanks. As they exited, tears glistened in the corners of his eyes, though he quickly blinked them away. He knew in that instant that no medal or title could outweigh what they had just accomplished. They had conquered the ghost of the past, stepping through the sands of doubt to claim a small piece of redemption. After the final obstacle, volunteers guided the competitors toward a shaded resting area. Horses sipped water from troughs while owners wiped sweat and dust from their flank. The official scoreboard flickered on a digital screen at one end of the arena, tracking each contestant's standing. Ethan found a quiet corner for Valor to recover. He sank down onto a folding chair, the brim of his hat shading his eye. The exhaustion felt bone deep, but there was also a lightness in his chest he couldn't quite put into words. Gavin bounced over with a plastic cup of water and a small packet of crackers. "Aren't you nervous, Dad?" he asked, glancing at the school board. "They're almost done tallying up the point." Ethan shook his head, taking the water with a grateful nod. "I've already seen him overcome what I never thought possible," he said, voice calm. "If we walk out of here with nothing more than that, it's enough." Gavin grinned, but behind his smile the boy seemed relieved. He probably wanted his father and Valor to win more than anything, but sensed Ethan's contentment. Nearby, Grace stood with a subtle smile, arms folded. She could tell Ethan's acceptance came from a place deeper than mere resignation. He had found peace in the fact that Valor had faced fear head-on and didn't crumble. The announcer's voice rang out again, calling for all participants to gather near the central podium. Ethan patted Valor's neck and rose, ready to see how he did, but the horse exhaled heavily, as if acknowledging the moment. One by one, the usual winners were announced. A well-known rancher claimed the top spot. Applause sounded dutiful but uninspired. Another rider was awarded second, then third, each stepping forward to receive a ribbon and pose for photographs. The audience clapped politely, though the earlier electricity seemed to have faded somewhat. Ethan stroked Valor's mane, preparing to leave quiet. He'd never expected a podium finish. A wave of satisfaction filled him just thinking about the final run through the quicksand hazard. Suddenly, the announcer cleared his throat and stepped back to the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, this year the committee has decided to present an additional award, something we're calling the Limitless Spirit Honor. A faint buzz of curiosity rippled across the crowd. The announcer continued, "This award recognizes determination and heart in the face of adversity." He paused, letting the words resonate. "We all saw something extraordinary today. A horse who was once left for lost, and a man who wouldn't give up. So it's only right that we recognize them for showing us what can happen when hope conquers fear." Ethan's heart stuttered. He glanced down at Gavin, who stared back with eyes wide as saucers. The announcer raised his voice. "Would Mr. Ethan Carter and his Mustang Valor please come forward?" A hush swept over the crowd, followed by a growing applause. People stood, some whistling, others calling out words of encouragement. Ethan swallowed, feeling a chest. He gently led Valor toward the makeshift stage. The horse seemed wary of the noise, but walked on with surprising calm. A small plaque was handed to Ethan, etched with words praising resilience and the ability to over. He ran his fingers across the engraving, trying to steady his breathing. Gavin darted up to him, hugging his waist. Grace followed, tears glistening as she watched her husband accept the award. Ethan leaned in and whispered against Valor's ear, "We did it, pal, winning or not. We did." After the ceremony, an impromptu gathering took shape around them. A few spectators who recognized Valor from the initial Amarillo show approached with kind words. Someone produced a camera asking for photos. Mr. Buckley ambled over, resting an arm on his cane. "Never doubted you," he gruffed, though the corners of his mouth hinted at a proud grin. Amid the swirl of congratulations, Grace finally reached Ethan, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "I used to think you might be hoping for too much," she murmured. "But now I see. Sometimes hope is exactly what we need to survive." He touched her cheek, realizing how far they'd come. Grace no longer wearing the worry lines that had once dominated her expression. He then turned to see Gavin crouching by Valor, arms loosely around the horse's neck. The boy whispered something that made Valor flick an ear. A sense of wholeness washed over Ethan, as though the missing pieces of their family had finally slid into place. That evening they returned home in a state of quiet elation. Grace cooked a hearty meal, her first ambitious dinner in months, filling the house with the comforting aroma of baked meat pie and fresh cornbread. They ate together, the conversation unhurried but filled with warmth. Even Valor seemed content, occasionally nickering from just outside the window, as if to remind them he was part of the family now. When the plates were cleared and Gavin had gone to bed, Ethan stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee. Grace joined him, leaning against his shoulder. They gazed out over the darkened fields. So many nights they had stood here, weighed down by uncertainty. But tonight the air felt different, lighter, touched by the hush of triumph. The greatest battle, Ethan realized, wasn't about beating the competition. It was about rediscovering the depth of faith in oneself, in the ones we love, and in the fragile yet unbreakable bond between man and horse. The days that followed the Tri-County Mustang trials seemed bathed in a subtle glow of positivity. The local newspaper, a small publication read by many ranching families, featured a photo of Valor standing tall beside Ethan. The plaque for the Limitless Spirit Honor clutched in Ethan's hand. The headline read, "Valor, a Mustang that wouldn't quit." Around Amarillo, people passed the story on through word of mouth. One teacher at the elementary school picked it up and used it in a reading assignment for her 5th grade class, urging students to write about perseverance. Soon the school's hallway displayed children's drawings of a grayish-brown horse, running under a bright Texan sun. Some depicted the horse with scars, others with a shining trophy, but all carried the sense of a triumphant second chance. At the local feed store, employees began referencing Ethan and Valor whenever a customer seemed doubtful about a scrawny foal or an old, neglected mare. "Hey, you never know, it could be the next Valor," they'd say with an encouraging grin. Even at the rusty spur bar, the jeers had turned into occasional toasts. Patrons still swapped gossip, but they also shared a sense of pride in the small-town underdog story that had captured so many hearts. Ethan tried to keep his routine the same, focusing on the daily tasks of running the ranch. Still, he couldn't deny the uptick in curiosity from the neighbors. Now, instead of suspicious glances, he received waves and nods. A few folks even dropped by to ask if they could meet Valor in person. In many ways, it was a peaceful transformation. A community reminded that hope can spring from the most unlikely places. And Valor, quietly munching grass in his upgraded paddock, seemed none the wiser for the attention. He had simply found a life worth living, and that was enough for him. One early afternoon, Ethan and Gavin perched together on the old wooden fence that encircled the pasture. The sun was mellow, not yet at its scorching peak, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers. Valor grazed contentedly several yards away, tail swishing to ward off the occasional fly. Gavin turned to his father, squinting into the light. "Dad, do you think Valor will get old someday? Like really old? Like Mr. Buckley?" he asked, a touch of worry in his tone. Ethan let out a soft chuckle. "I'm counting on it, son. I want to see him live out a full, happy life. Eventually he'll slow down just like all of us." Gavin watched the horse for a moment before speaking again, quieter this time. "Will we keep him forever?" "Forever's a strong word," Ethan replied, resting his elbows on the fence rail. "But as long as I draw breath, I don't plan on letting him go. He's earned the right to stay." He ruffled his son's hair. "You remember one thing, though. Never walk away from something good just because other people can't see its value." Gavin nodded, soaking in the wisdom. He seemed to understand that the lesson wasn't just about a horse, it was about life. Ethan sensed the subtle shift in his son's demeanor, as though the boy was building his own quiet reserve of faith. The same faith that Ethan had once nearly lost. They sat like that for a while, father and son, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. Each found comfort in the slow rhythms of the ranch, the distant bleat of goats, the rustle of leaves, and the comforting presence of Valor, a living testament to second chances. The final rays of sun stretched across the land, painting the aging barn with a gentle glow. The same barn that once smelled of rot and neglect now felt warm and secure. New beams replaced the rotten ones. The roof was mended, and the interior was lined with clean straw bales and organized tack hooks. Ethan walked Valor back to his stall for the night, a simple routine that had become a moment of reflection. The horse gave a soft snort, nuzzling Ethan's hand as he unlatched the door. The memory of their first nights together flickered across Ethan's mind. The trembling creature that couldn't stand without quivering, the haunted look in its eyes. Now he saw an animal at peace, a horse that had reclaimed life, one cautious step at a time. "War took a lot from me," Ethan said softly, running his fingers through Valor's mane. "But thanks to you, I've taken some of it back." Valor bobbed his head gently as though acknowledging the words. In the hush that followed, there was no need for grand gestures. The quiet of the stable felt like the most profound conversation. A small sigh escaped Ethan's lips. Relief, gratitude, and perhaps a lingering hint of sorrow for what was lost in another time, another land. A stray breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of sweet hay and the promise of a calm night. Valor nudged Ethan's shoulder, a light nudge reminding him that he wasn't alone. Ethan chuckled softly, rubbing the horse's neck in return. Outside, the sky burned into a deep orange streaked with pink and gold. Grace stood near the fence, watching them with a contented smile. In the distance, Gavin could be heard calling for the family dog, the boys' laughter echoing against the endless Texan backdrop. As dusk settled, the last glow of daylight stretched across the ranch, revealing not the hardships of the past, but the infinite potential of tomorrow. And so ended the day, not with a trophy or any outward fanfare, but with a sense of unbreakable belief. Victory had never truly been about winning a competition or earning a plaque. It was about a quiet resolve that binds a family together, about the courage to stand by something as fragile as hope. In that small Texas town, a once-forgotten Mustang named Valor had not only reclaimed his strength, he had shown an entire community, and one war-weary veteran in particular, that sometimes it takes a broken spirit to teach us what it means to be whole. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out, hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us. Deputy Vance leaned against his cruiser, notebook forgotten. He had seen men act tough, but Gavin didn't need to act. His calm was born from pain and purpose. Dr. Halberd ran a weathered hand down Ashfire's neck, murmuring words only the wind could hear. "This one's got fight in him," he said. "And so do you, Gavin." When the storm broke that night, Gavin didn't seek shelter. He stood beside Ashfire, soaked and unmoving, because that's what trust looks like in its rawest form. Talia Monroe stayed by the barn doors longer than she meant to. Watching the way Gavin moved around the injured Mustang, she saw something healing in both of them.